Hello, my beautiful lost souls. As always, if you'd rather skip my rambling and go straight to the stories, you'll find all the timestamps in the pinned comment below. But before we begin, a little bit of news. The Eldritch Narrator is now on Spotify. You'll find the link in the description below. I'm currently uploading the entire back catalogue there, so when I unfortunately have to start removing some of the older videos from YouTube, as I mentioned in my return video, those stories won't disappear. You'll still be able to find all of them, old and new, completely free on Spotify. And for today's video, we're going back once again to our beloved Weird Tales, with 3 stories pulled from the pages of our beloved magazine. We begin with The Weaving Shadows by W.H. Holmes, a supernatural mystery set inside an old family home where strange shadows begin moving through the darkness, bringing with them something far more sinister. Then we have The Witch of Kravetz by Michael V. Simko, a dark tale of love, superstition, and cruelty, centered around the mysterious Lavinia and the terrible reputation that grows around her. And finally, The Last Cigarette by Greye Spina, a short, wonderfully cruel little story about pride, appearances, and one final cigarette with a rather unfortunate sense of timing. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's return to the pages of Weird Tales. Chet Burke was lazily reclining in his favorite easy chair, absorbed in a rare book on alchemy and black magic, when his sister answered a summons at the door. In addition to managing the household affairs of the apartment in which she and Burke lived alone, her duties also consisted in scrutinizing the many visitors. Most of them could be persuaded to call at the bookstall, which Burke conducted when not devoted to some criminal mystery that held him until it was solved. Others, whose cases were urgent, were admitted to the apartment, thus infringing on Burke's only recreation, reading and study. The visitors were Chief Rhine, a friend of Burke's, of the Rhine Detective Agency, and a stranger. Burke laid aside his book and greeted the callers with a friendly nod. Rhine, a portly, flushed man, settled his sturdy body into a convenient chair. The stranger, an intelligent-looking man, appeared ill at ease. He stood self-consciously beside Rhine, absently running the brim of his soft hat through browned, muscular-looking fingers. "Burke," grunted Rhine heavily, "meet Mr. Hayden. He is bothered about a very mysterious affair. It has worked on his nerves until he has decided to consult an expert. It's beyond me, so I brought him around to you." Rhine sighed with relief and eased back in his chair. Hayden stuck out a rough, calloused hand to Burke. His bronzed face flushed slightly at Rhine's statement. "I am more concerned," he said, in a surprisingly agreeable voice, "about how you will receive what I have to relate. I can hardly believe yet that the things exist, although I have seen them 3 nights in succession." He shook his head in doubt and sat down mechanically in the chair that Burke drew up. While Hayden was gathering his thoughts, Burke quietly sized him up. Hayden appeared to be a man of about 45. His face was deeply tanned, and his appearance suggested many hours spent out of doors. Burke noted at once his trait of eyeing one direct from warm brown eyes. He was garbed quietly, and evidently in his best. His dark suit was set off by square-toed shoes, above which glared white socks. A low, soft, white collar with a black string tie completed his obviously habitual concession to dress. On the whole, Hayden struck the detective as a wholesome type of the practical mechanic. "Now, Mr. Hayden," said Burke musingly, his eyes half-closed and vacant, "state your case fully. We will try not to interrupt you." The detective lounged down in his chair, his heavy lips slightly drooping, and his long legs crossed indolently in front of him. His eyes had their customary vague stare through the tortoise-shell glasses that veiled them. Hayden drew a long breath, then exhaled it in a long sigh. With a brisk straightening of his shoulders, he said, "I am a carpenter. Until recently, or, to be exact, until 4 days ago, I lived in New Orleans. I am a bachelor, and it doesn't make much difference to me where I live, so long as I can find work at my trade. Therefore I came up here, to Sunken Mine, in the highlands of the Hudson, to live with a widowed sister and her daughter." He paused, and his eyes grew reflective. For a moment he was evidently measuring his words. With a quick intake of his breath, he resumed. "My sister lives in an aged, pre-revolutionary house, deep in the mountains. It is a lonely place, and a secluded dwelling. At one time it was probably a restful-appearing country farmhouse. Today it is a weathered frame building set in a grove of dead and whitened chestnut trees. The house is a 1-story and attic affair, with rough stone fireplaces at the side and a long sloping roof that pitches low at the rear. Owing to its age and the condition of the place, it is a dreary spot for one used to the city. My sister affects ancient, antique furnishings, which does not lessen the impression of living in the past. As soon as I crossed the door-sill, I was affected by this vague, misty remembrance of being there before. It may strike you as strange that my sister picked out a place of this type to spend the remainder of her days, but she had, to her and her daughter, good reasons. Both she and my niece are earnest spiritualists. Both receive messages and are, in truth, sincere mediums. For some reason, my sister claims that the atmosphere of the old dwelling helps them to materialize those that have gone before. I myself have considerable faith in those things, although I treat it in a practical manner. I only believe what I actually see. What I am about to relate, I have both seen and felt." Hayden paused for an instant to stare earnestly at Burke. The detective nodded to him to continue. "I have read deeply," went on Hayden, "and in my spare time I could be called a bookworm. I work at my trade, but live much in the past, especially in books. For this reason, I could be sympathetic to my sister's idea of living close to her life's hobby, or her mission, as she calls it. There is one more reason why my sister purchased the place 6 weeks ago. It was the original settling place of the family, before the Revolution. As the result of a family tragedy, some 100 years or more ago, the place passed into other hands. Few new buildings are constructed in that sparsely settled, unfertile section, and most of the houses have stood for generations. Consequently, the old Hayden house was never disturbed. At the time it came back into the family, it was vacant and for sale. They had been living there about 2 months when I came there to live with them. The room I occupied Sunday night is on the 2nd floor. It is a semi-attic room, lit by one window. Before I came, the room was occupied by my niece. On my arrival, it was arranged for me, and the girl and her mother occupied a bedroom downstairs. It was around 11:30 Sunday night when I went to bed, and was soon asleep. I awoke with the feeling that something was stifling me. It was as if I had a heavy cold and found difficulty in breathing. This peculiar sensation of suffocation finally caused me to rouse into complete wakefulness. The strange smothering seemed to ease as I got more fully awake. Unable to fall asleep again, I lay looking out of the window at the stars. The bed is at the end of the room, and the window was in direct sight. The house was intensely still. I noticed this in particular as I remarked the absence of the city noises I had been used to. I can't recollect that there was so much as an insect stirring. My own breathing, as in imagination I still struggled for breath, was the only sound. It appeared to fill the room with a hoarse, rasping murmur. I likened myself to a dying man, gasping his last breath. This fancy, to one of my usual practical trend, was perplexing to myself. Still, in the few moments before the things appeared, my thoughts apparently dwelt on uncanny ideas. At the same time, I was conscious of a queer tingling of my body. As I lay staring at the faint light of the sky, I slowly became conscious of a singular illusion, or, as I am at times led to believe, a startling visitation. The dark shadows of the room appeared to be dancing rapidly before my eyes. They were streaming in long wreaths, coiling in fantastic spirals, and wafting through the room in wide, level films of blackness. I don't know how I could see this, but it was plainly visible. Yet the room, except for the faint light that came from the clear, moonless sky, was in fairly deep darkness. It seemed that the moving shadows that formed before my eyes were only discernible because of their greater density. I can only liken this uncanny movement of the shadows to swaying and floating clouds of tobacco smoke when one is smoking slowly and freely. For some moments I watched the movements of the shadows. Then I observed that they were forming in a more stable order. They were now lying in long, round coils of blackness, horizontally across the room, and twisting rapidly. For several moments they lay motionless, except for their rapid turning. Then, as if stirred by a firm, direct breeze, they undulated toward the head of the stairs. This drift brought several horizontal layers into contact. At the moment of their touching, the shadows seemed to weave into huge rolls, which streamed from sight rapidly down the stairs. The room now appeared to grow lighter, and the air clearer. Also, all sensation of smothering had left me. I lay there quietly after the disappearance of the shadows, pondering over the strange affair. So far, I was fairly calm, except for the wonderment of the thing. The return of the shadows was cause of my fears and suspense as to the final outcome. My eyes were gazing absently out of the window, as I had not turned my eyes from the stairs after the black rolls had streamed down them. Slowly, so slowly that it scarcely seemed to move, I saw a black, human-like form rise above the sill of the window. I could just see the top of it as it mounted the stairs. I watched it with a keen realization that it had something to do with the shadows. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, the round, head-like shape continued to rise. I could now see it plainly, outlined against the lighter sky. The shape now rose to its full height. It had the form of a shapeless human figure. That is, I could distinguish the smaller head shadow above, and what would answer for a body, if one were at all imaginative. The thing passed beyond the window and drifted into the darkness at the end of the room. Yet I could still make out its vague form by its greater blackness. My eyes went back to the window. Another figure was slowly blocking the cheerful light of the sky. Again a black form emerged to its full height. It joined the first. I am not a coward. I lay quiet, wondering what the thing presaged. The two figures advanced to the center of the room. They were now fairly discernible. One of them walked to an old-fashioned dresser at one side of the room, stood there a moment, then joined the other figure. With this, both shapes turned and passed down the stairs. As they were disappearing, I called. The forms were so clear, and I was by this time so far from sleep, that my mind hit on a logical reason to explain the thing. It was evidently my sister and my niece. They had wanted something from the dresser, and, not wishing to disturb me, had come up quietly, got what they wanted, and then returned to their room. Getting no answer to my call, I sprang out of bed to convince myself of the truth of my belief. I went downstairs and to their room. Both were in bed and fast asleep. I awoke them. Neither one had been up since retiring. I did not tell them of the black forms, but made some excuse for awakening them. The remainder of the night I spent in the kitchen, sleeping in a large rocking chair. Hayden paused and stared at Burke. "Go on," said Burke shortly. "This would not have brought you to me." Hayden shook his head. "No," he said. "It was what came after. This same night, as I arose from the bed, following the disappearance of the two forms down the stairway, I had reached the center of the room when I became conscious of standing in something that was wet to my feet. I was barefooted, and when I looked at my feet I found them soiled with blood. Naturally, I thought that I had cut myself, but a close examination revealed no cut or bruise of any sort. I lit a lamp and went back upstairs. My first glance was at the spot where I had first felt the wetness. A glance revealed the cause. Directly in the center of the bare board floor was a large pool of fresh blood. It was slowly spreading out over the floor and sinking into the dry wood. I cleaned it up as much as possible and then searched the room thoroughly. There was absolutely nothing that I could find that would explain the blood. The next morning, both my sister and my niece complained of feeling languid and fagged. My niece, a very white, frail girl, was even more colorless than usual, and her mother, noticeable for her deep, intense eyes and the black rings that encircled them, seemed listless and indifferent to everything. Noting this, I scrubbed up the bloodstains before they made up the room and said nothing of what I had seen. Things were normal until Monday night. Again, about the same hour, I was awakened by a smothering sensation. Once more I heard my own breathing as I gasped for air. As I got more fully awake, I found that the smothering sensation grew more intense. I sat up in bed, crouched over like one suffering with the asthma and striving to fill my lungs with air. But this did not relieve my distress. Unconsciously, my eyes were fixed across the dark room. Again occurred the weaving of the shadows. Panting, stifling, and seemingly unable to arouse myself enough to get out of bed, I watched the repetition of the scene of the previous night. Once the horizontal streams of shadows were formed, my breathing became more normal, and I seemed to regain the power to move and think clearly. I then deliberately waited to see the finish of the affair. The banks of twisting shadows disappeared down the stairway, and the two figures repeated their previous trip. As soon as they had descended past the window, I sprang from bed and lit my lamp. My eyes went at once to the floor. The pool of fresh blood was there for the second time. I let it lay and tiptoed downstairs and to the women's room. Both were in a sound sleep, but I was struck at once by the haggardness of their features. I did not awake them. Getting a basin and water, I returned upstairs. I again scrubbed up the floor, this time with much care, as the stain had now gone deep into the aged boards. Leaving the lamp lit, I went back to bed. Finally, I fell asleep. Nothing occurred during the remainder of the night. The morning after this second visitation, resumed Hayden, I again remarked the extreme pallor of my niece and the haggard, gaunt face of her mother. Still, I remained silent, determined to solve the riddle for myself. Last night I retired early, and I took several precautions. First, I secured an electric flashlight. Next, I powdered the stairs with flour. I also sprinkled the floor on the attic room. I now had a trap that no human being or any mechanical figure could tread over without leaving a trace. This done, I blew out the lamp and went to bed. I lay awake for a matter of 2 or 3 hours. I was determined to stay awake until the shadows commenced to form, or until I began to feel the smothering sensation. In this way, I would have a grasp on it from beginning to end. But in spite of my resolution, I fell asleep. I was again awakened by an uncanny feeling. Firm hands, or rather some peculiar force, seemed to hold my arms down on the bed. I sought to draw up my legs in order to slip out of bed, but found them held by an unyielding power. Finally, I discovered that I was unable to move any part of my body. I was certainly awake, yet I was as helpless as a person in a nightmare who fancies that his body is totally paralyzed. Forced to lay motionless, I saw the black shadows stream from various parts of the room. This time they formed over my bed. I could feel them drift across my face, spinning, waving, and twisting and contorting. It was an unearthly feeling, lying there helpless to avert anything that might happen. There is nothing I can describe that would be similar to the feeling of those black forms ceaselessly in motion. It might be likened to some invisible force that presses on one, or to a heavy fog that a person seems to feel in a material manner, with a strong impression of its dampness and chill. This helplessness and the weaving of the shadows went on for perhaps 5 minutes. Then, as the twisting rolls started to stream down the stairs, I could feel my body regaining its power. With the disappearance of the materializing forms, I became physically and mentally myself again. I then got the electric torch in my hand, ready to flash it at the proper moment. The figures rose above the stair, and I directed the bulb of the light toward them. I waited until they advanced to the center of the room, then I threw on the light. Hayden wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. His lips were dry, and his face flushed. Then, with a slight shudder, he went on. At the instant of the flash, the darkness of the figures was gone. Instead, I saw 2 faces. They were inhuman, horrible, and impossible to describe. They leered at me with their shadowy, devilish faces, scarcely discernible in the glow of the torch. They seemed to be mocking me. They were corpse-looking and repulsive, but the eyes were terrible. They were full and real and glowing with a hellish, vengeful fire. But with all the horribleness of the faces, it was not they that held me motionless. It was at that moment that I discovered the source of the blood. It was dripping out of the air and falling in a steady patter. I glanced up at the ceiling, but it was firm and unbroken. While I watched, it was scarcely a second. The drops seemed to form in the air above the floor. They were rapidly ceasing when my nerves gave way for the moment, and I let out an involuntary yell. With the cry, the dripping blood suddenly ceased, and the faces vanished. This brought me to my senses. I sprang from bed, determined to see the thing through. My first act was to scan my trap. I followed the flower down the stairs, but it lay in a white, unbroken dust as I had scattered it. That night, also, I looked in on the women. Both were sound asleep, but I was deeply shocked by their distorted faces. Shaken both mentally and bodily, I once more spent the rest of the night in the kitchen rocker. And now I want someone to go up there with me, examine the house, and spend the night in the room. I am troubled, nervous, and frightened, both for myself and for those with whom I live. I will go there with you, replied Burke evenly, and I think the 2 of us should accomplish something. We can probably handle 2 shadowy forms. Hayden smiled dolefully. They handled me last night, he said ruefully. I'm a pretty strong man, but something held me as helpless as a baby. Burke alighted at a lonely way station, standing on a strip of land between a wide marsh and the Hudson. The marsh ran to the foot of the mountains and lay sere and rippling in the September breeze. Hayden had stated that the dwelling stood back in the hills, a distance of some 5 miles. On Burke's suggestion, they started to walk. Burke wanted to study the country and, incidentally, study his companion. The country he found to be sparsely settled. The road wound up through forest-clad rocky hills. The dwelling stood beside a wide stretch of woods, with cleared fields to the north. Burke scanned the dwelling as he approached it, and found it to be the usual type of farmhouse of a century ago, buried among dead trees. The interior of the house was in keeping with the exterior. Oval frames held old prints, horsehair upholstered, massive dark furniture contrasted with tables and stands covered with white marble tops. The chairs squatted grimly in the quiet rooms and rested on dull rag carpets. The woman and her daughter struck Burke like beings transported from the misty past. The mother was a tall, sparse woman with heavy black rings about the eyes. The eyes, black and dreamy, held Burke with a steady, unwinking stare. The daughter was the opposite of her dark, sallow mother. She seemed a lifeless, colourless sprite, seemingly alive by the power and vigour of her more intense mother. She was about 20 years of age, although her chalky face and thin, bloodless hands, together with her slight frame and indolent movements, seemed to signify an elder age or some wasting disease. Both were of the dreaming, musing type, speaking softly and briefly and moving silently about the quiet house, and both were garbed in dresses of white material. Burke's first act was to visit the room upstairs. There was nothing to warrant his attention except the stained floor. He ripped up several splinters and put them in his pocket. He then announced his intention of visiting the nearest town, several miles to the south. Hayden asked no questions, evidently placing the affair entirely in Burke's hands. He remarked that he would walk down a ways with the detective and await his return. The two women were still unaware of Burke's vocation, and accepted without comment Hayden's statement that Burke was a friend that was to remain overnight. As soon as Burke arrived in town, he went at once to the chief of police. Here he inquired for someone qualified to make an examination of the blood-stained splinters. He was directed to a doctor who maintained a laboratory. The latter, after a lengthy analysis, confessed himself puzzled. Something was missing in the composition. He could not account for the peculiar results he obtained. It was human blood, and yet it was not. Burke returned to the chief of police and inquired about the Haydens. The chief was unable to give Burke any satisfaction, but directed him to an old settler in the vicinity who could probably furnish the desired information. Burke found the family without trouble. They were willing to talk, but they knew very little about the Haydens, though a good deal about the house. Over 100 years before, they said, a widow and her niece had lived in the then new dwelling. The place, a flourishing farm, which had since been cut up and sold off, was managed by the woman's stepbrother. The family were more or less secluded and seldom seen. In the course of weeks it was noticed that no one had seen the two women. The brother was at the house alone and refused to talk. This led to an investigation. No trace of the women was found. The brother was never brought to trial, continued to live on the place until he died of old age, and had prospered. His heirs had taken over the place, and it had been gradually dissipated, until only the house and an acre or so of land remained. Burke listened politely, then, thanking the old couple, returned to the Hayden house. Hayden was awaiting him. That evening, Burke sat beside the open fireplace, listening to the low, earnest conversation of the others. The woman and her daughter he observed closely. They seemed to be possessed of some restless emotion that caused them to wander aimlessly around. On the contrary, Hayden appeared to be sluggish and incapable of extended speech. This struck Burke as queer, as he had remarked the vivid description Hayden had given of the attic room. At 10 o'clock the women announced their intention of retiring. Bidding the two men good night, they withdrew to their rooms. Burke and Hayden, the latter almost stupid and listless in his movements, went up the narrow stairs to the room above. Both lay on the bed fully robed. Burke saw Hayden take a revolver from his pocket and shove it under his pillow. "What shall we do?" asked Hayden heavily, seemingly unconscious of anything around him and staring vacantly at the ceiling. "Well," replied Burke quietly, "first we will blow out the lamp." He got out of bed and put out the light. Returning, he crawled on the further side of Hayden, leaving Hayden on the outside. Burke had no desire to be on the firing side of the revolver in the event that Hayden should start shooting. The detective lay for an hour, pondering over the strange case. Finally, he spoke to Hayden. The latter did not reply. He was apparently fast asleep. Yet, as Burke listened closely, he could discern no signs of the latter's breathing. Burke now experienced a singular emotion aroused by the intense silence of the room. The longer he lay, the more impressive it became. Downstairs he heard the low chime of a clock. It struck 11. The minutes lagged along in the forbidding silence. The clock chimed the half-hour. 15 more minutes passed. Hayden, breathing heavily now, commenced to move. Burke half arose on his elbow and listened. Hayden was muttering in his sleep. Burke eyed the dark shadows of the room with keen eyes. Nothing met his gaze. He glanced to the window. Nothing there. Hayden was suffering tortures in his struggle for breath. The detective was on the point of shaking him when, with a heavy, prolonged gasp, Hayden sat up. Burke sensed the horror of the man, yet he remained motionless. His eyes were fixed on the dark, silent room, wandering frequently to the window. Nothing unusual was to be seen, and he watched the vague form of his bedmate. The latter was now rigid, struggling with the weight that oppressed his lungs, and apparently staring off into the room. Then, to Burke's amazement, Hayden started to breathe normally. "Burke," he whispered hoarsely, "did you see it? Did you see them pass down the stairs?" "What?" grunted Burke sleepily. "My God," muttered Hayden, "you were to watch, and you fall asleep. They have gone down the stairs. They'll come back again in 4 or 5 minutes. Watch!" Burke made no reply. He, with his wide-awake companion, was staring intently at the window. Suddenly he felt Hayden stiffen. "The head is just coming up the stairs," whispered Hayden. Burke felt the movement of Hayden's arm as it slid under the pillow. Then came the blinding flash of the revolver and its roar. Twice Hayden pulled the trigger. By that time Burke had flashed on his electric torch. The room was empty. Burke glanced at the floor. No blood was visible. Hayden was panting and rocking back and forth. "I feel awful queer," he groaned. "Something is dragging me." Mechanically he arose from the bed and stumbled onto the floor. "It tells me to kill, kill," he mumbled. "Kill with my revolver. Kill. Who shall I kill?" Burke silently followed the plodding form of the other. With measured steps, Hayden stalked to the stairs and passed down, with Burke close behind. Hayden led the way directly to the room of his sister and niece. Without hesitating, his fingers grasping a loaded billy, Burke trailed close and waited for the moment when he should be needed. Hayden appeared unconscious of the light furnished by Burke's torch, nor did he once turn on the short journey. Reaching the side of the bed in which the women were sleeping, he paused and stared rigidly down. Burke joined him. His light was now on the 2 women. He was struck by the horrible contortions of the faces, seemingly drawn in agony. With a sudden premonition, he bent down and felt the motionless forms. The girl's hand was limp and lifeless. He felt the pulse of the older woman. Both were dead. The detective turned to Hayden. He was staring down, dry-eyed. "I see," he said stupidly. "Both dead. Kill, kill. Who was I to kill? Not them. They're dead. Something still tells me to kill." He sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. Burke lit a lamp that stood on a heavy dresser and put out the torch. He stood looking down at the 2 women. He then noted that the room was growing shadowy. He glanced at the lamp. It was full of oil, and the wicks seemed to be burning freely, yet the light continued to lower. Burke again glanced at the 2 women. Slowly, almost invisibly, he fancied that the agonized features were changing to the repose of death. Hayden arose and came to the detective's side. He was muttering and softly moaning. Burke watched him. Hayden, with a sudden start, looked across the room. "They're coming back," he mumbled, weaving and twisting. His eyes moved slowly from the opposite side of the room, as if he were following some moving object. They came to rest on the women's faces. "Streaming down their mouths," he muttered. "They're sucking in the twisting rolls. They're coming to life." Burke glanced at the women. In the dim light, he could have sworn that he saw traces of returning life. At that moment there came a crashing report at his side and a blinding flash. With that, the light flared up bright, and the dead faces were revealed. Burke whirled around. Hayden was sinking to the floor, a bullet hole in his head, from which the blood was slowly starting to emerge. Burke sank beside the man and lifted his head. Slowly the heavy form relaxed. Hayden opened his eyes to stare with bewilderment at the detective. In another moment he was dead. Burke placed the body on the floor and went to the bed. Once again he endeavored to find a trace of pulse in the still forms. Both were lifeless. He fancied that both dead faces bore a peaceful look, and on the elder woman's slightly opened lips there seemed to hover an exultant smile. Closing the room, Burke got his coat and belongings, then locked up the house. Some hours later he was sitting with the chief of police, relating the tragedy. The chief drove with Burke to the sheriff of the county, and together they went to the house. The sheriff had called up the coroner, and they found him waiting for them. A brief examination of the women revealed that both had died of heart failure, probably induced by some unexplainable shock. Burke took the sheriff aside. On the detective's suggestion, they wrecked the attic room in a thorough search. Burke wanted to locate the source of the dropping blood. At the conclusion of their quest, the mystery was finished. For Burke. But it was to Rhine that he confessed his failure. Returning to his apartment in New York, he found Rhine there. "Well," cried the latter, as soon as he appeared, "did you solve the mystery?" "No," replied Burke, "I did not." Rhine's eyes opened. "Well, what did you find?" "Over the attic room," said Burke musingly, "we found a small, crypt-like space between the ceiling of the attic room and the roof of the house. It was encased in plaster. As we broke through the ceiling, a mass of human bones came tumbling down. The coroner pronounced them the skeletons of a woman and a girl. Both had been dead for generations. Through the shoulder blade of the girl's skeleton was a jagged hole. When the bones fell, the elder woman's skull rolled to my feet. I picked it up. Something rattled inside, and I worked it out through the eye socket. It was a slug of lead. Both the woman and the girl had been murdered. On a newly constructed rostrum, publicly exposed to the devouring eyes of the populace, stood the famed beauty of Kravetz. With bowed head she submissively waited. A slight wind played havoc with her loosened flood of dark hair. The women saw it. They noted its abundance and glorious luster. Their hearts were sinful with envy. Her divine form, with its sensuous lines, was suggested by a single wrapper that inadequately covered her quivering body. Like a martyr saint, she calmly expected her destruction. Slowly, inevitably, the clock approached the hour of noon. In the southern part of Russia, some 100 kilometers back from the Black Sea, lies a fertile expanse of land, sparsely populated. As far as the eye can reach, roll verdant pasture lands and arable ground. This pleasant and productive territory of Kravetz was once under the dominion of a Count Darumkov. Sacrilegious and tyrannical, Darumkov ruled his peasants with the hand of a despot. But it is unkind to speak evil of the dead. And Darumkov is dead. The district, with its scattered, low, whitewashed huts, acres of waving rye and rich brown tillable earth, pleased the eye as one let it survey the landscape, until it rebelled at the incongruous appearance, in this scene of contentment and harmony, of a small lake. Its stagnant water was putrid and infested with disease-carrying mosquitoes. A stunted growth of trees bordered this lake on one side. The opposite border presented a huge excavation, jagged piles of heavy stones, loads and loads of lumber, and countless barrels of hardened mortar. It was apparent that the erection of some edifice had been suspended. The confused growth of weeds, the decayed appearance of the stacked lumber, the wild grass struggling up between the rocks, the hardened mounds of earth, the deep cellar foundation, all indicated that this chaotic condition was not of recent years. The natives tell tourists about this weird section. The region is haunted by a woman. Men are her chief victims. Echoing across the land come from the unfinished mansion the agonizing cries of this woman. Sometimes she sings. It is hard to resist listening to her song. The charm of her voice at night, like a siren's at sea, has lured many a young man to his death in the murky water of the lake. None feared those nocturnal, spectral sonatas more than Count Darumkov and an aged, half-crazed man called Simeon Lavkovich. Of the latter it has been said that, unable to control himself, one night he roamed about the ghostly premises until he was positive the voice closed its deathly song with his name. In a sibilant whisper it trailed off, "Simeon, Simeon." Peasants found the man the following morning. He was exhausted. His head was white. He lay in a frightful fit on the edge of the lake, not far from the neglected foundation. His eyes were terrible to see. He mumbled insanely, calling over and over a name that sounded like Lavinia. They dragged him to his feet. His head fell forward. His bulging eyes saw, fastened to his coat lapel, strands of beautiful dark hair. He tore away the raven threads, and his face was like putty. Cold drops of perspiration stood out all over it. He collapsed like a hysterical woman. From that day, Simeon Lavkovich did not know his own mind. He tramped the streets. He ate whatever he found, in the gutters, in backyards. His life was a dog's life, a dog without a master. People pointed after him. The children, quick to grasp such things, found him a subject for their calls and ridicule. They jeered at him. They threw stones after him. They tapped their heads significantly. They stuck to his heels as he fearfully sought escape. This was a pitiful reverse. The illiterate peasants knew nothing of Simeon before he came to their village. They could not know that once he mingled with Moscow's best society. It was better that they were in the dark about this fact. Simeon Lavkovich had been called to Kravetz from Moscow by Count Darumkov to design a suitable palatial residence on the border of the lake in the Count's estate. Simeon had gained enviable popularity as an architect. He was a carefree, dashing young man with blazing brown eyes and a defiant, stiff little moustache. He had the deportment of a prince, the intellect of a genius, and the tongue of a poet. The débutantes lavished their affections on him. And he was a fit subject. No girl could resist Simeon. Pompous matrons contrived to ensnare him. Simeon was considered a favorable matrimonial subject. Simeon was not only an architect, he pursued this vocation for monetary reasons only. He liked to be poetic. He flavored all his actions with a peppering of romance. In his heart he believed some divine goddess would one day lay her soul at his feet. These pampered, idle, luxury-loving ladies nauseated his quixotic temperament. Their gold was venom in his flood of sentimentality. Into this pool of disfavor came Darumkov's opportune request. Simeon did not wait long to make reply. The social requirements of court life had gradually become so abhorrent to him that he gladly accepted the Count's offer. With little delay, and with abbreviated adieu to his many friends, Simeon set out for Kravetz, where a temporary home was erected for his exclusive use during the building of the Count's mansion. Simeon gave himself wholly to the task confronting him. He undertook the work with a zeal that surprised him. The new surroundings exhilarated him. He loved the simple peasants. He basked in the respect these naive illiterates tendered him, a gentleman from the big city. Fashion did not dictate here. He dressed as comfort suggested. No formality soured his carefree existence. He exulted in this new freedom, and he had foolishly caged himself in a city of big buildings and chained his days to a program of social activity. The excavation was completed, and work was rapidly progressing on the foundation of the mansion when Simeon Lavkovich first met the famed beauty of Kravetz. Late one afternoon, Lavkovich galloped his steed. He rode out of the domain of Kravetz and broke into a wild canter across the barren steppes adjoining the district. This limitless expanse enthralled him. The silence and magnitude of the rolling land was appalling. He rode over this waste with no regard for the time of day. When the sun threatened to disappear below the horizon and an awesome dusk furtively crept over the land, Simeon brought up his horse with an ejaculation. His heart began to experience a fearsome constriction. How should he turn? How was he to be guided on his return? He turned his horse and let the beast choose his own road. It was a long and lonesome ride, through a blackness that enveloped him like a cloak. His fatigued horse refused to respond to entreaties, spurs, or whip, but staggered ahead with head almost reaching the ground. The silence of the steppes filled the man with unaccountable terror. Simeon's strained eyes at length detected a distant glimmer of lights. He exclaimed like a truant boy. His heart pulsed happily. He begged his horse to quicken his pace. The patient steed must have sensed the proximity of humanity and possible prospects of food and rest, for he picked up his head, raised his ears, and put new vigor into his exhausted limbs. Before this lonely cottage, Simeon drew rein. A haggard crone came in reply to his repeated knocking. She eyed him suspiciously. His plea did not interest her. She hardly waited for him to finish. He followed her. She silently led the way down a dimly lighted hall and motioned him to sit down in the adjoining room. The man stood stupefied on the threshold. His amazed eyes surveyed the colorful landscapes on the walls, the unique draperies, the unexpected splendor of the furnishings. The sight of a grand piano was enough to dumbfound one in a peasant's hut. He stepped into the center of the room, the better to observe a painting. The rustle of skirts and the slightest breath of a heavenly aroma startled him. He sensed another's presence in the room. He turned slowly and almost gasped in dumbfounded adoration. He wanted to fall on his knees in reverence. The blood rushed to his head. It pounded in his temples. His tongue was chained. The holy charm of her whirled him into another sphere. Now he realized that he had fallen under the divine eyes of the noted enchantress of the steppes. They called her that in Moscow. He had heard men speak of her. He had heard nobles rave over her. The unequaled charm of this woman was history. Men had offered fabulous riches to her. She had spurned them. She stood tall and majestic in the doorway, the velvet portieres parted by hands of a grace and whiteness he had never before beheld. An abundance of black glossy hair was coiled on her regal head. There was that white sheen to her forehead, neck, and shoulders that recalled newly washed marble. In her adorable lips was that moist, pink fullness, with a petulance that craved pressure from another's lips. In her eyes, scarcely glowing through half-closed lids, smouldered the soft, amorous fire that had seared the heart of many a noble and would turn the heart of a monastic. It had already wrought destruction with Simeon. He was shamefully disconcerted in her queenly presence. "I am Lavinia Turgino. Would you wish anything of me? My servant is dumb. She could make no answer to you." It was a voice worthy of her white throat. Once, in a cathedral in Petrograd, Simeon had heard an organ. Her voice was like that, heavenly harmony. At Moscow, Simeon was an intrepid youth. The glamour of jewels, the eyes of vain women, the prestige of titled names, were only molehills to the fearless youth. Here, isolated from all social revelry, an unaffected, unadorned woman made him feel like a penitent schoolboy in the august presence of a new teacher. He recalled his dust-covered attire, his dishevelled hair, and a new wave of despair and agitation played havoc with him. "My servant will give you to eat. You must be hungry. The way to Kravetz is long. It is best you lodge here for the night. She will look to your comfort. Good night." She was gone. There was an ebbing rustle and a vanishing atmosphere redolent of roses, and he was left alone. He swallowed with ease again. His heartbeat gradually subsided to normal. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You fool! You square-headed idiot!" he hatefully denounced himself just as soon as he realized his tongue was at his own disposal once more. "Can't you talk to a lady when you see one?" The servant interrupted his soliloquy. He followed her. The savory table reminded him of his neglected stomach. He set to it avidly. But not for long. There was no relish in his eating. Her visionary presence made everything else but looking at her distasteful. The crone showed him to his room. He was tired. He lay in bed. He could not sleep. The darkness was ablaze with her face. Lavinia. Would she appear at breakfast? He could not leave without one more sight of her. Lavinia. Who could have selected a more suitable name? Her eyes would enslave all Moscow. God! If he could bring her out! Lavinia. A wonderfully charming name. From that memorable night, Simeon's heart knew no peace. He loved the lady with a madness that recognized no bounds. Like every other man, he fell to wondering why such a charming woman should seclude herself, and with a dumb servant live the life of a recluse. Why had she refused in marriage such men as had come to her from marble halls, and laden with purses heavy with gold? She was a lady with heart of stone, they said. Simeon came again without being invited. He came many times. This was not to her liking. But Simeon was persistent. And Simeon had brown eyes and a stiff little moustache. She liked to see his mouth twitch. He smiled often and showed wonderful teeth. Despite her aloofness and coldness toward him, Simeon Lavkovich would not be discouraged in his pursuit of her heart. One night, after he had said good night, she came to the door. For a long time they looked into each other's eyes. A fearful fire burned in Simeon. A surge of passion possessed him. He refused to steel himself against it. He dropped his hat. He caught her to him. He pressed her fervently against him. His mouth sought hers. She resisted. She surrendered. She melted in his embrace. She felt his lips tight against hers. Her head fell back. A thick strand of hair fell away from her right ear. It exposed a dark spot, not as large as a 10-cent piece, just below her ear. Lavinia started. She struggled out of his arms. Her face was crimson. She hurriedly tried to arrange the truant strand. Simeon only laughed. He bent over her and kissed the discoloration. The days hurried along. The foundation for the Count's palace was nearing completion. It was almost time to lay the cornerstone. Lavinia found her barrier crumbling. Long had she kept it impregnable to dukes and princes. A dashing, impecunious architect had undermined it. She could not repel the attention of Simeon any longer. She admitted that his impulsive manner and tempestuous love-making captivated her. She laughed when he told her that he would bring the priest to marry them. They were not empty words. Simeon came one afternoon. The priest was with him. Lavinia turned white. Her voice trembled. "Simeon Lavkovich, I can't. Oh, I can't marry you. I can't." "But surely, my adored one, you will not refuse me. My love for you is like a fire. It is eating my soul away, and if you will not accept me, I shall most certainly die of its burning. Tell me, at least, why it is you remain so cold to the blazing adoration of my love." "Yes, yes, I will tell you." She wavered, then impetuously continued, "Oh, Simeon, I love you." The words filled him with a wild joy. He crushed her hard against him. His fervid kisses covered her neck and cheeks. Long they clung to the fullness of her lips. Those words had never before left her mouth. They fed the fire in his soul. "Oh, my blessed one, my Lavinia, say no more. Come, let us be married. And, after the ceremony, if you wish, you can tell me what is troubling you. I am wild with happiness. You have made me insanely happy, my Lavinia." He rushed out to call the priest and 2 friends who acted as witnesses. The charming Lavinia sank into a chair. She struggled to hold herself together. It was a severe trial, this marriage ceremony. Her only words to him were, "And Simeon, you'll not reproach me. You shall love me for all time. Always, even though. Hush, my dearest. Even in eternity I shall adore you." So they were married. That day Simeon Lavkovich's star fell. He became a different man. Some said he had lost his reason. People marveled at the cruel reverse Lavkovich displayed. The serfs, a superstitious lot, had always doubted Lavinia. Now they became more bold and voiced their belief. Surely the beautiful Lavinia had bewitched Simeon Lavkovich. The young man began to drink heavily. His behavior terrified the natives. His despotic commandeering over the workmen became unbearable. They protested to Darumkov. He listened, and came down to watch Simeon at work. In another day, Simeon was replaced by another capable man to complete the mansion. The day for laying the cornerstone of the Count's castle arrived. Kravetz and the surrounding country long anticipated this event, chiefly because a barbarous custom was to be enacted. It was the burying alive of a member of the female sex to fulfill the belief that the living, quivering body of a girl would knit together the walls of the great building and preserve it against disaster in the future. Count Darumkov suggested that one day be devoted to volunteering. In the event a virgin did not offer herself as the victim of this sacrifice to a mass of stones, a married woman would be acceptable. On the other hand, if no volunteers appeared, all women of the village would be set in line, and a committee would select the fairest 10. From this final group, the fatal choice would be made. The woman must possess beauty without a blemish. Her condition must not be impaired by any significance of unhealthiness. It was believed a diseased person would bring sickness and misfortune to those living in the mansion. Prior to the dreaded day of selection, after volunteers failed to present themselves, it became rumored that Simeon Lavkovich had offered his beautiful wife, Lavinia. She submitted herself as the subject of this sacrilegious practice. Such news was incredible. That the most charming woman of Kravetz should resign herself to such an ignoble fate when she could have lived in royal halls. And why should Simeon make such an offer to favor the man who had discharged him and pronounced him unfit to complete the work on his home? The committee appointed by the Count to choose the unfortunate woman gladly accepted Simeon's wife. They little relished picking out a girl for such a dreadful death. They wished their hands clean of blood, and gladly agreed to Simeon's one condition, that instead of examining her they take his word for it, that her beauty was without a mark, and that her splendid appearance vouched for her robustness. On the appointed day, late in August, long before sunrise, the people from far and near poured into Kravetz. The adjoining towns and hamlets had heard of the event. Such an affair came once in a lifetime. It attracted people from distant places. Every buttress, pinnacle, porch, window and roof that offered a point of vantage was congested with men and women and babbling children. At 11:15, the procession passed about the foundation. Lavinia was in the lead, sparsely clad in a wrapper that clung to her shapely body. The retinue consisted of the Count, his family, and intimate friends. They sat themselves on a bedecked stand while a guard assisted Lavinia up a pair of stairs to a rostrum erected for this special purpose. She was the cynosure of all eyes. Her quiet composure appalled the multitude. The abundance of her thick, long hair fell over her shoulders down to her waist. Her queenly head was now modestly bowed. She felt the ruthless eyes of an avaricious throng searing her body. The clock lacked a minute before the execution of this atrocious act. A silence covered Kravetz. The beating of hearts was almost audible in the oppressive stillness. A feverish glare came into the eyes of a tense crowd. Women clung to supports with nervous fingers. One man, in an isolated corner on a housetop, was on the verge of collapse, but the seething fire of vengeance urged him to keep his place and witness the outcome of his craftiness. Simeon had reached the hour of his hateful triumph over the woman who had played him wrong and the man who had discharged him. The voice of conscience hummed in his ear. In vain it whispered, "But was it not your own will that precipitated you into this marriage? Had she not warned and resisted you? Your ear was deaf to all she would say." He refused to listen. He hardened himself against this ordeal by having frequent recourse to a bottle hid in his coat. In maudlin tones he incoherently mumbled something about beauty and health. He would bring in the Count's name. Then he would laugh in a way that was not pleasant to hear. The time had come. The Count's arm was raised. The multitude did not breathe. The arm was motionless. A heart-aching second followed. Then the hand fell. It was the signal. A cord attached to Lavinia's single piece of raiment was drawn. With a swish, the wrapper left the girl. It was an awful moment. The charm of her body was exposed to prove to the people that she was sound and beautiful. The frightful sight of her nudity stunned the spectators. Women screamed and covered their faces with their aprons. Men turned away. A wild cry went up to heaven. The nobility stood up in a body. Darumkov swore shamefully. Before he could remonstrate, before his agonized cry, "Away, away with her," had left his mouth, the sacrifice was completed. His words came too late. By some misapprehension, the rostrum was prematurely destroyed. It crashed into the excavation ready for it, and the suspended giant buckets suddenly precipitated tons of earth upon the body of beautiful Lavinia, smothering her last and only cry. Some said it was a prayer for mercy. Some said it was a burning curse. Simeon hid himself. His foresight had selected a place several days previous. The amazed multitude dispersed in fearful awe. They blessed themselves repeatedly. The women affirmed their suspicions. Like fire spread the gossip, "Truly she was a witch." In the brief time of exposition, the populace well saw Lavinia's body. The skin was that of a leopard's. Ugly, irregular black spots disfigured the whiteness of her body, and the naive peasants called it witchcraft. The physician in attendance, a guest of the Count, later explained to Darumkov. The woman was suffering a condition known as melanosis, in which the skin becomes abnormally crowded with dark pigmentation. In some cases, the entire body is covered with this hideous discoloration. Save for the spot below her ear, Lavinia was fortunate to be able to keep her condition a secret, except, of course, from the man who married her. Milton Wheeler's thick-set body shivered as he put a match to the wick of the oil heater, noting mechanically that the reservoir was almost empty. Before he could get more oil, he would have to settle that already large bill owing the grocer. He paced the floor to stir his torpid circulation, rubbing his stubby hands together briskly. His grey suit was much too light for November, and his undergarments, repeatedly darned and patched by Agnes' hands, too thin to yield their original warmth. He owed the tailor for that new black overcoat. As for the underwear, he would first have to pay for last summer's things and for the new black hat before ordering other garments. A black suit he had not quite dared to order. Not that the tailor had actually asked for money, but he had observed casually that he wouldn't send in his little bill until after the funeral. After the funeral? Milton shivered again, this time not with cold. Everything was coming in. After the funeral. He felt that Agnes had dealt him almost a personal blow by dying. Without her cooperation, how could he keep up his pretenses? It would be a few days only before his hated rival would learn upon how small a foundation had been built Milton's house of sham. That Benson, who had in everything but the winning of Agnes triumphed over him, should learn of his failure to make a success financially, was to Milton a frightful tragedy. Milton had had a few $1,000s in bank and a fair salary at the laboratory when he married Agnes, winning her from Benson, who had large private means. It was the first time since they two had been boys in school together that Milton had triumphed over the other man. It had been indescribably galling to him to think that Benson would ever learn how much Agnes had lost in marrying a poorer man. Agnes had rebelled at this deception in the beginning. She did not care, she said. But then she saw how keenly Milton felt about it, how his every thought was turned in the one direction. Poor girl. Her first unkind act had been her desertion of him at this critical moment. Milton had managed to fool everybody. He had kept up a lavish establishment, spending his principal freely. He had bought Agnes everything that could make the impression of unlimited means upon the rejected Benson, whose keen eyes he fancied were always upon him. Agnes' death, however, found him penniless, without a position, confronting a mountain of unpaid bills. Rent, unsettled for 4 months. Groceries, the sum was almost staggering. Butcher, how could they have consumed such quantities of meat? The doctor. Somehow this account had mounted up to much more than Milton had anticipated. There must have been many visits to the office of which Agnes' husband was ignorant. She must have kept her sickness from him a much longer time than he had realized. To the doctor's statement, Milton had pinned, with sardonic humor, bills from the druggist, the florist, the undertaker. Then there were coal bills, laundry bills, ice bills. The sum of those items marshalled itself before him with malignant triumph, conveying to his shrinking spirit the overwhelming provision of defeat. Men were being turned away everywhere. He might be months finding another such position as he had been holding for 4 years. He might raise money to settle that appalling total of debt by paying the exorbitant interest rate of some loan shark, but even this would be only a temporary relief. Discovery of his castle of pretense was inevitable, and to him disclosure of the real facts meant such complete, such utter ruin, that the bare idea bowed him down into the very dust of humiliation. He could see Benson's smile. There was only one way out: death. It was distasteful to him, because his death under present circumstances would mean the disclosure of what he had for 3 years been struggling to conceal. His death, with the revelation of that appalling sum total of debt, would make him the subject of derision for his rival. If there were only some way to escape without bearing his sordid secret to the world. He whipped his dulled mind into unwilling concentration, and then, suddenly, he had it. Within the dusk, the little heater cast a circle of friendly radiance. Milton threw a glance upward. The lamp hook in that great beam across the middle of the ceiling looked strong enough. In the laundry there was always plenty of good rope. He would bring up a stepladder. Half an hour later he jimmied open from the outside one of the study windows giving on the garden. The gusty November air swirled into the room, setting the curtains aflutter. Upon the floor, under his writing desk, he laid a $10 bill, as if it had been accidentally dropped by hurried fingers. The balance of his last week's salary he tore carefully into small pieces and burned, scattering the ashes on the night wind from the open window. He pulled out both desk drawers, tossing their contents upon table and floor, as if some unlicensed intruder had gone through them hastily. Upon the bronze tray on his desk he laid a sheet of paper, inscribed with a few terse, carefully thought-out words. He had disposed of all his securities, he wrote, to charities in which he and his wife had been interested, but had left sufficient cash in the desk drawer to settle all outstanding accounts against his estate. He chuckled as he wrote, a humorless sound, and then, shrugging his thick shoulders, finished. "I cannot live without Agnes. I am going to join her." In those last moments he was capping the edifice of sham with the most marvellous of cupolas. He was putting the finishing touch to a work which for 3 years had been the driving force of his life. From boyhood he had had the worst of it with Benson, always. Now Benson would be unable to smile in that slow, exasperating way of his. No, Benson would be obliged to think of him with astonished admiration. He felt malicious enjoyment as he surveyed the indications of burglary, and the note that so well covered the traces of his supposed wealth. The fools would believe he had killed himself out of grief at the loss of his wife. They would continue to admire and envy him, and his secret would remain undiscovered. Everything was ready. He lighted a cigarette contentedly. When he had finished this last smoke, he would climb the ladder, adjust the rope. It would be the greatest triumph of his life, after all, this death. His only regret was that he could not be there to enjoy the effect of the stupendous climax. His cigarette finished, he flung the butt away and mounted the ladder. He felt gingerly of the rope knotted about his neck, shuddering involuntarily. If it were not that by dying he was making his secret secure for all time. After all, it was the only way. Setting his teeth, he pushed against the ladder with both feet. It toppled to the floor with a crash. As his body was whirled about by the tautening rope, a flare from the bronze tray on the desk caught Milton's eye. In that last poignant moment he had the mortification of observing that the cigarette butt had fallen upon and ignited the suicide note that curled, crisped, blackened to an indecipherable ash before his agonized eyes.